we're going to show you a war game. You will see and hear a U.S. president deliberating with his top national security advisors on a crisis even more dangerous than anything that has ever really happened between the United States and the Soviet Union. The crisis, which we'll outline for you in a couple of minutes, is imaginary. The world situation, in other words, is not real. Although, as you'll soon see, that at times will be difficult to remember. What we have tried to make as real as humanly possible in this war game is the process. We want you to see how, in a time of great international crisis, an American president and his most senior advisors act and react. Obviously, no game, not even the most carefully planned and executed war game, can ever duplicate a real crisis. And no players can ever feel the same pressures during a war game that would come with reality. But the players assembled for this game have acted similar parts on the world stage. They have sat with real presidents in the White House Situation Room during real crises. Many of them you will already know. But for the purposes of this exercise, let me reintroduce them to you in the roles they will be playing in this war game. President of the United States, Edmund S. Muskie, former U.S. Senator from and Governor of Maine, Secretary of State under President Carter, now a Washington attorney. Director of Central Intelligence, William C. Hyland, Deputy National Security Advisor to President Ford, formerly career CIA official and State Department Intelligence Chief, now a senior associate of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. National Security Advisor, Winston Lord, Director of Policy Planning in the State Department under Henry Kissinger, former NSC staff and Foreign Service officer, now President of the Council on Foreign Relations. Secretary of Defense, James R. Schlesinger, Secretary of Defense and Director of Central Intelligence in the Nixon administration, now a consultant and investment banker. Deputy Secretary of Defense, Antonia H. Shays, Undersecretary of the Air Force in the Carter administration, now a Boston attorney. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Edward C. Meyer, U.S. Army, retired, Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army from 1980 to 1983, now a consultant. Senior Advisor Hodding Carter III, Assistant Secretary of State in the Carter administration, former editor of the Delta Democrat Times, now a television journalist. Senior Advisor Richard Pipes. Senior NSC Advisor on the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe to President Reagan, now back as a professor at Harvard University. Deputy Secretary of State Richard C. Holbrooke, Assistant Secretary of State in the Carter administration, former Foreign Service officer and managing editor of Foreign Policy magazine, now an investment banker and consultant. Secretary of State Clark M. Clifford, Secretary of Defense in the Johnson administration, advisor to Presidents Truman and Kennedy, now a Washington attorney. You've met the players in this crisis game. Now it's time to become acquainted with the crisis itself. It's not real, but it is as real as a top-flight group of former government, military, and intelligence experts could make it. They make up what is known as the control group. To introduce them and the scenario they contrived, here is ABC's Rick Endifirth.
The control group, made up of former government officials of both parties, a former U.S. military commander, and a leading academic, had three main responsibilities. First, to choose the players. Second, to devise the crisis scenario. And third, during the game, to react to the players' decisions, in effect playing the Soviets, the Allies, the Congress, and the media. The players received their briefing books 1 week before the game began. Enclosed was a document entitled The Crisis Prelude, which served as a foundation for the game, this fictional account of events set in the year 1985. Iran's internal divisions were evident during the revolution that toppled the Shah in 1979. With the death of the Ayatollah Khomeini in 1985, they again rushed to the surface. Demands for autonomy from Iran's ethnic minorities are heard daily. The new leader of the Islamic Republic can do little about them. Although the war with Iraq ended the year before, Iran is a spent nation, exhausted from the fighting, adrift politically. March 1st, a date that signals the breakup of Iran as a nation. An independent republic is proclaimed in the southeast. March 15th, a leftist revolutionary government is established in the northwest. Its leaders call on the Soviets for help, and they respond with military equipment and advisors. April 2nd, another rival power center forms, this one in the oil-rich southwest. An Iranian army officer rallies anti-leftist forces. The U.S. soon comes to his aid, also with arms and advisors. By mid-April, the opposing forces are engaged in heavy fighting. But by the end of the month, the U.S.-backed forces appear to be gaining the upper hand. Meanwhile, U.S. intelligence has been monitoring the mobilization of Soviet troops along the northern border of Iran. By April 25th, all 20 Russian divisions in the region are up to full strength. At the same time, there are disturbing signs of unusual Soviet military activity in East Germany, where political unrest is increasing. The Soviets announced that major Warsaw Pact training exercises will be held beginning May 1st. Still, the focus of American attention is on the Persian Gulf. The president warns the Kremlin that grave consequences will follow if Soviet troops move into Iran. To underscore that message, the president dispatches a second aircraft carrier battle group to the region. In addition, a U.S. military exercise in Egypt and Oman involving elements of the 82nd Airborne is extended, in effect placing these troops on alert in the region. At home, the Rapid Deployment Force is also put on alert. While some of his aides argued for even stronger measures, the president favored a moderate approach, believing that it offered the best chance to avoid a superpower confrontation over Iran. But that was not to be. On May 1st, U.S. intelligence confirmed that at least 4 Soviet ground divisions are crossing the Iranian border, and elements of a 5th, a Soviet airborne division, now occupy 2 key airfields further south. The president calls for an emergency session of the National Security Council, and they meet in this room to consider the American response. And so, the crisis game begins.
I'm certain none of you are surprised that we are around this table at this point. I've asked you to gather here to consider a matter of the greatest urgency, a matter the dimensions of which I am sure has impressed all of us. Events in Iran and in Central Europe, actions by the Soviet Union, confront us with a situation which needs analysis, a situation which carries the gravest sorts of risks of escalation to an unacceptable point. In my judgment, this is not a situation in which either the Soviet Union or we have a nuclear option, strategic or tactical. And I think that ought to be made clear to the Soviet Union. Neither of us, in those respects, has the means to gain an advantage over the other at this point. And there should be no ambiguity on their part or on our part in this connection.
Bill? Mr. President, let me start, with your permission, and give a few of the highlights of where we stand as of this morning. The main fact, of course, is that elements of 5 Soviet divisions, motorized rifle divisions, are moving into Iran, into northern Iran. In addition, and I think this is very significant, elements of 3 airborne divisions have already landed at 2 airfields at Kermanshah and Hamadan, and we have a map. If you'd like to see it on the map, I can show you now. They're converging on Tabriz, where there is already a MiG-23 regiment, about 30-some aircraft. And that's the only Soviet aircraft already in Iran. They're moving along the coast here, which is going to be a critical thing for us to watch, because at some point they're going to have to turn, and at that point we will have a better idea, that may be a few days, whether they're going to move towards Tehran, which is right here on the map. In addition, in the Soviet Union, across the border, to the west of the Caspian Sea, as well as in Turkestan, they are mobilizing and have been mobilizing for several weeks, bringing these divisions up to strength. And as far as we can tell now, they're probably at full strength. They were what we call Category 3 divisions, about half strength. And of course, they have 100 and some thousand troops in Afghanistan in addition. The other highlight, I think, is in Europe, where today, May Day, which is quite unusual, a Warsaw Pact exercise has begun involving 20 Soviet divisions, 12 of which are moving from the western military districts of the Soviet Union into Eastern Europe. As you know, we've had a lot of reporting on trouble in East Germany, and that's a very unsettling situation for the Soviets, and this exercise may be designed to take care of that situation psychologically. They did notify this exercise under the rules of the Helsinki Conference, so it wasn't a surprise in the sense that we didn't know about it in advance. I would say this is probably the most military activity we have ever seen on the Soviet side, certainly since the invasion of Afghanistan in '79.
Where is the line of division in 1943 when the British and the Russians divided the country?
This was, I'm not sure, Mr. Secretary, where that line was, but I can find out. The other relevant fact, I think, is where the so-called autonomous republic was in 45-46 when the Russians stayed in Iran. One thing is clear, and that is those airborne divisions I mentioned are well beyond that boundary line, so that they cannot really claim, the Russians can't claim, that they are doing what they did previously, just coming back to a line of the old Azerbaijan Republic, because they're well beyond that.
Bill, do we have any information about any request from anyone inside Iran for help from us?
We have a request for aid from the friendly forces, a request that more or less is the framework for this meeting, because since the Russians have been coming in, the Russians have made an announcement that they were coming in. I sent to you their announcement that they were coming to the rescue of the government, which is an interesting phrase. We got then an appeal from the forces in Iran friendly to us for assistance, and that is pending. That is now an outstanding request, which I presume we have to address and deal with.
There was an appeal over the radio, I think.
With respect to the Central Europe situation, is there anything unusual out of normal in the Warsaw Pact maneuvers that are taking place there?
No, well, only the date. To have a maneuver begin on May Day is just frankly strange.
Good morning, Mr. President.
Two quick questions. Has there been any contact between Soviet forces and Iranian forces since they moved into those two airfields? And second, where are the American advisors? Are they close to that line?
With respect to the first question, there has been some contact between the arriving Soviet forces and some dissident Iranian elements, which are even located in the area generally controlled by the pro-Soviet remnants of Iran. So there has been some displeasure on the part of some Iranian elements in this part of the country. There has been no major activity, however, between Soviet forces and the pro-Western Iranian forces.
No combat.
In broad terms. That's correct, sir.
Where are the Americans?
The Americans that are advisors to the Iranian forces in this sector of their country are largely located with the headquarters down to brigade level that, in oversimplified terms, are sort of on this side of the Zagros Mountains.
Could you tell us what kind of a problem the terrain in that region of Iran poses for the Soviet forces?
This is a photograph which outlines the terrain in that particular region, Mr. President, which might give you some appreciation of how difficult it is.
Thank you,
John can point out to you where the road is that he pointed to on this other map.
This is the area of operation we're speaking of, sir, with a mountain range like this, and this is a very good example of a road in the northwest sector of Iran. You'll notice the narrow defiles and the S curves that exist there.
Well, movements through that area would appear to be very vulnerable to air power.
They're very vulnerable to air power. They're also very vulnerable to a few people on the ground who can blow the sides of the roads or can blow the bridges.
Which is one reason the Russians have already started to put MiGs into Tabriz in that very area.
Any further questions on the military situation? Thank you very much.
Mr. President, from the Soviet Union has always regarded its ability to deny oil resources to Europe as probably the single most valuable lever against Europe. And if the Soviet Union were to gain control over Iran and therefore over the Persian Gulf, because there would be no force able to stand up to it, then in fact it would have an ability to cut off oil from Europe, and this would have a profoundest effect on the survivability of NATO. And that's, I think, the stake which is involved.
So what you're saying is that the invasion of Iran is directed not so much upon Iran as it is upon Europe.
Yes, I think it's a flanking movement against Europe that is meant by... I think a primary Soviet objective has always been to decouple Europe from the United States, but because of the enormous concentration of forces in Europe and the enormous risks of unleashing a war, they have always preferred to use a roundabout way, and that way has been via the Middle East, where European oil resources are, and via South Africa, where European mineral resources lie, to choke European economy and to bring it down to its knees.
Bill?
We can't, I think Dick's right in a long-term perspective, but we can't be sure at this point of what the Russian objective is. They could have a limited aim to try and rescue, as I said, this revolutionary alliance, draw a line and perhaps wait, who knows, a long time before moving. They could, as implied in what Dick said, they could move steadily right to the Gulf, because he's right. Nobody can block, nobody on the ground now could block a Soviet military takeover of the Gulf. But we don't, I would caution at this point of being absolutely sure that this is what they intend to do.
Jim wanted to...
I agree with the director, Mr. President. I'm sure that, as Mr. Pipes has indicated, that the ultimate Soviet objective is to detach the United States from Western Europe. But they may have, and probably do in this case, more immediate objectives, reversing the outcome of 1946. I suspect that at this time, given the shift in the balance of power that has occurred over recent decades, that the Soviets will refuse to be denied the spoils of victory in the North, and that they will be prepared to dig in there. It is a larger objective, and if they see little resistance, they will sweep on towards the Persian Gulf. I think, while we wish to come to remedies at a later point, that we should recognize that an early objective is to pose to the Soviets the very, very great risks of encountering the United States if they go beyond the lines that are now established. We will not be able to reverse, I fear, the immediate effects of the takeover of the area that they occupied during World War II.
I think we should not assume that that it's impossible to get the Russians to retreat from where they have come thus far. They lived with an Iran from 46 to the overthrow of the Shah that was basically hostile to them. Since then, they've lived with an Iran that is not friendly. I am not persuaded yet that the Russians, under certain circumstances, would not be willing to restore the status quo ante. But I agree with Dick that they will not get out just because they have come in and done their job.
I regret that I must leave at the moment to attend another meeting. There are other functions that I have to serve. But I would hope that you would continue this constructive discussion, and I'll turn the meeting over to the Secretary of State for the time being.
Thank you, Mr. President. We must now address ourselves, I think, to the first question, and that is, what are the American stakes that exist today as a result of this action on the part of the Soviet Union? Jim, you want to start that off?
Well, Clark, I think the discussion has touched upon all of the major points. It is necessary for us to preserve Western access and Japanese access to the oil fields of the Persian Gulf. Without that access, as Mr. Pipes indicated, the whole structure of post-war politics would disappear immediately. But it has also been touched upon that Soviet control of northern Iran may change the balance of political forces in the region, leading to a subsequent erosion. The question is whether, with the means at our disposal, we can reverse that, or whether at this stage we must insist on containing the risks, but that we are not in a position to reverse it.
I think let's go back very quickly to a point raised earlier. I'm assuming we would all be agreed that if we knew that the Soviet plan was to move right through Iran, clear to the Persian Gulf, that we would feel that our national interest and our national security were so involved that we would have to move. Is that a general consensus of this group?
I think that it would be a severe blow to allow the Soviet troops to stay anywhere that they crossed a recognized border. I consider it to be a severe blow. I do not consider it to be a strike at the vitals.
Mr. Secretary,
keep in mind that I want comments, but I want you also to be making up your mind.
I think one thing we have to consider about that is the actions that may persuade them that we will not let them go to the Gulf could also be actions which will persuade them that we're going to agree to a partition of Iran. If we begin to occupy or challenge or whatever those areas that are now under American influence or control, which would block their way to the Gulf, they may read that as saying, therefore, the line we are now drawing is acceptable. In other words, you are accepting Soviet occupation of northwest Iran.
Just in that regard, so it doesn't slip us, thinking of the statement that comes out later, are we prepared to recommend to the President that he condemn vigorously this move by the Soviets into Iran?
Absolutely.
There's no question in anybody's mind in that regard, is there?
And I think that that helps the problem that the director has alluded to. We are going to begin, I believe, to move forces into the region, but it will not be clear to the Soviets what our ultimate objective may be. There remains some ambiguity about whether or not we will tolerate their seizure of northern Iran. Under those circumstances, we should begin to move our forces. I think that General Meyer touched upon this earlier. Let us recognize that we are 7,000 miles away, and that every hour that is lost gives additional time to the Soviet Union. We should, I think, be prepared to recommend to the President that we begin prudential deployments at this time. First of all, it will demonstrate the seriousness of the United States, about which there may be some doubt in Moscow. Moreover, and following the President's initial remarks, it diminishes the likelihood of a major clash by underscoring to the Soviets that they will not have a free ride. At the moment, they just might believe that they will have a free ride to the Gulf. And the Soviets will continue to be extremely reluctant with their own forces to attack the forces of the United States.
All right, well, this is a very definite position. It brings into focus immediately assuming we were to adopt that approach, do we do this unilaterally? Or do we first see if we can't get our allies? I think the pressure on the Soviet Union is infinitely greater if, for instance, the United States and NATO could move. Now, we as a nation are really no longer dependent upon Middle Eastern oil. We could get along probably pretty well without Middle Eastern oil. It's Great Britain and France and Belgium and Italy and Germany and Japan and others who are dependent on the oil. Now, if they should tell us, notwithstanding that fact, they are not prepared to support us or to join with any troops in going over and protecting Iran. Does it seem feasible for us to do it on our own, when, as a matter of fact, we were really doing it in the main for their interests?
That, Mr. Chairman, is the responsibility of a great power. In circumstances of this sort, the United States, as the only superpower in the West, must take a worldview. And regrettably, our allies are able to look at things more from a parochial view than we are. Indeed, we are able, through the movement of forces, if the Soviets continue to be prudent, as they have been in the past, to provide a military barrier that will protect the Gulf. I think that irrespective of the degree of material support that we get from our allies, that we should be prepared to do that.
The President.
Well, I take it.
President, while you were gone, we had a rather thorough and full discussion, and when you are ready, then Winston Lord will give you a brief report of where we were.
Briefly where we are, then what I think you ought to decide before we leave this room. Now, with respect to the discussion, particularly in your absence, Mr. President, I think there is a clear split among your advisors between what is really a vital interest to the United States and what is not. The split being those, I believe, including your Secretaries of State and Defense, who feel that however important it is to try to get the Soviets out of Iran altogether and to establish the principle that such aggression is not justified, would tend to define as absolutely vital stopping the Soviets to moving toward the oil fields and the Persian Gulf. On that, there's unanimity, I believe, among your advisors that it is unacceptable for the Soviets to move all the way south to the oil and the Gulf. Therefore, the question really is whether one can devise a strategy to at least secure that goal without necessarily deciding among your advisors at this point on whether we should roll them back at some point. Then, Mr. President, we have a whole series of diplomatic and domestic political actions that we have to decide upon. On the diplomatic front, as I suggested, consulting with our allies, and not only in NATO, but other countries like Japan, the Gulf countries, friendly countries like India and China, and what we say to the Soviet Union, either privately or publicly. Finally, there is the domestic situation. You have underlined the absolute imperative of consulting with the congressional leadership and getting their views on what we should do, including the specific question of the War Powers Act. We also have to consider what our public stance is going to be with respect to a statement after this meeting and other public remarks we should make, and whether you or other administration officials should be stating our positions in public.
When you say some kind of American deployment into the area, what are you specifically proposing?
We had discussed earlier the criticality of the security of the oil fields themselves. And so what we would be looking at would be a force adequate to ensure the security of the oil fields and the capability to provide assistance to the pro-U.S. forces that are in there so that they're able to carry on the fight out in the forefront.
Mr. President, I just want to underline in the area of risk what I mentioned briefly in my summary, and that is you have to take into account what will happen if the Soviets continue to move south despite our deploying this force. And I'd welcome the assessment of whether they, in fact, could overrun us with the kind of forces they're deploying, because then you will face another decision down the road, and I think we have to keep our eye on that.
In my judgment, if they were to move currently with the forces that they've indicated, with the 5 divisions that are currently employed, and if we were able to get our 3 divisions in there with the pro-U.S. forces, that they would not have sufficient force in being based on Soviet doctrine to feel comfortable in attacking south from there. They normally want to get at least a 2.5 to 3 to 1 advantage. They would not have that. So with the current balance of forces, it would not be a problem. But if they then send the rest of those 20 divisions in, then we have a different situation.
Does not
and that
raise
would be
the question of whether you need,
inadequate.
even if you deploy this force, whether you have to consider mobilizing other forces for that contingency?
There's absolutely no question in my mind that if you put those forces in there, you have to be ready to send additional forces in to reinforce them.
I want to underline something, Mr. President. You, at the very beginning of our meeting, I believe effectively ruled out a nuclear option in this crisis. I believe this has already leaked somehow to the press and is on television. In any event, if in fact that is our policy, then I would like to get again a sense from our military experts. If the Soviets reinforce and we reinforce, can we have a stalemate, at least conventionally, in that area?
Depends upon how long. Depends upon how much time we have to reinforce the 3 divisions that we're talking about over there. What we're able to do in that area.
Mr. President, we now do have the film on the press leak, and I think it might be useful to take a look at that and exactly what is in the public domain. And apparently they're ready to do that. Could you show us the film of the press leak, please, on the monitor?
This is David Shoemaker at the White House. Administration officials say the president has ruled out even considering nuclear weapons in the current showdown with the Soviet Union, and he's taking steps to make sure the Kremlin knows it. The president apparently is determined to keep this crisis from getting out of hand. Sources tell me that practically the first decision the president made at the National Security Council meeting was to rule out the nuclear option. But we've also learned that that decision has provoked a bitter split at the top levels of government. Some officials are arguing that the president is sending the wrong signal to the Soviet Union, that with the Soviet manpower advantage on the ground in the region, he's made a mistake in ruling out tactical nuclear weapons which could provide the crucial balance. Just how serious this split is among the president's top advisors and whether they'll be able to provoke a reconsideration of his decision can't be determined at this time. This is David Shoemaker at the White House.
Maybe we ought to invite him to join the meetings.
Yeah, we ought to have a debate.
Mr. President, this indicates a couple of things, sir. The first is that there is more than one reason for some speed in decision-making. That story, to the degree that it is accurate or to the degree it is not accurate, begins to cast policy in the public's mind in a way which will make it more difficult for us to take policy steps later. It also sends other messages to other people, including the Soviet Union. But I in fact, hope that we might discuss again for a moment whether, in fact, that is the correct message. Because politically, sir, there are some difficulties in suggesting that we are going to send our troops into that area, in essence, naked, without the possibility of tactical weapons in an overpowering situation.
The leak does, of course, suggest the importance of speed, but I don't think we should allow what the press reports to determine our actions in a matter of such incredible national danger.
I've really not heard yet, many of you, what happens if these forces we insert into Iran are not successful in preventing the Soviet surge to the Gulf. What are our options then? What do we do then? Now, if we say in advance that I've changed my mind about that, let's assume that that's a viable thing to do at this point, that I've changed my mind about what I said earlier today, then what would the signal be to the Soviet Union? That we expect, that we reserve the nuclear option in this situation. Is that a useful signal to send?
Mr. President,
Jim.
We are looking at alternatives. It is true that there is some risk that even with the deployment of 3 divisions, that the Soviets will continue to move, and that they will ultimately batter up those 3 divisions in whatever reinforcements we can provide. There is that risk. I think that it's a minimal risk. Since World War II, in each and every circumstance where a line has been drawn between the United States and the Soviet Union, they have respected it. They have moved into this area with, I think, tentative objectives. I do not think that they will wish to precipitate a clash with the United States with the implicit risk that you suggest. Against the risks, and I would hold them very low in percentage term, perhaps 10%, that the Soviets will continue to move, we face the consequences of not doing anything, and we cannot afford to neglect those consequences. If there is no stopping of the Soviet Union at this stage, they will roll to the Gulf. They will bring about the fall, I suspect, of the regimes on the west side of the Gulf, and the international geopolitical arrangements will be transformed instantly by their control of the oil tap. That is catastrophic, Mr. President. Against that sure catastrophe, we face a limited risk that the Soviets will be prepared to clash directly with American forces.
Jim, it may be that sometime we might have to face up to it. I can understand that. I think this is the wrong time. By their moving in, maybe it's 100 miles, into Iran, we then say to ourselves, this is it. We're now prepared to send our troops over there because we think that they might possibly move again. I think that's a dangerous approach to it. I'm not sure that they want to move again, particularly in view of the position that we take in the world and the kind of support that we would get. I think that if we get support and we have a month in which to move, assuming that we do, and we get lots of support, then we might decide to put a United Nations type of army, or just us and our allies in there. But I fear that if we go in now and throw the gauntlet down, they will feel then that the issue is joined, and it's the U.S. against the Soviet Union, and that even though they might have decided only go a smart, short way originally, we might get a reverse reaction to the presence of our troops there, and they might feel they'd have to go ahead and move against them.
One question, Clerk. What would you do if we failed to get substantial Allied support? Would that mean that we did indeed abandon the entire Gulf area to the Soviet Union?
No.
If we are going to move later, unilaterally, it is wiser for us to take advantage of the time that is available and move now. A move now will show the U.S. lead. If we flounder around for 72 hours, 96 hours, 1 week, attempting to elicit the international approval, that in itself is a signal of a weakness of will on the part of the United States. If we are going to go in ultimately, then we should, I think, go in now with a minimal move that can preserve the structure of the free world. If the Soviets take over the Gulf, we are not going to have those allies to worry about any further.
I can see one result of this course of action that is disastrous. We move right away, as you say, within 72 hours. We get a force in there that allays the concern of our allies, and they say, well, no, we can't afford any troops. So we're in there all together, alone. The Soviets use that as an opportunity to move against us. And sometime they may have been loath to shoot American soldiers. I don't believe that's the attitude now. I think the attitude in the Soviet Union is one of bitter hostility toward the United States. I think they would welcome the opportunity to engage in this conflict so near their border. We get into the conflict. We lose 1,000 men, and we lose 10,000 men, and we get up to what we lost in Vietnam. We lose 50,000 men. We don't have any allies with us, and we're fighting it out there, and I will guarantee to you that it'll lose the support of the American people. And then I think we've got a terrible mess on our hands.
The Secretary of State has raised a critical issue. Do you start by seeking the support of your allies, deferring the beginning of military moves until you know the degree of support, or do you begin with an American action and then try to bring other countries along?
I think we've reached the point where we have to make a decision. It's not an easy one to make. And I must say that I wish we'd had more of the time available to work out some of the details of the accompanying initiatives that need to be taken. I think that on the basis of the arguments that have been presented here, it's not easy, that I will approve the strategy of the limited insertion of troops. But I think there's a lot more to be worked out.
Mr. President, I want to be clear now on your decision, and let me see whether I have it correctly. As I understand it, you would like the military to move out so that we will be in a position to insert a force into Iran, but not actually to do so until you authorize that further action. But you want plans to be drawn up, deployments to be made that will give you that option, and the General can correct me if I'm stating it incorrectly, but that you do not yet wish to actually insert a force into Iran, but you want to move in that direction while all your other diplomatic and other preparations are underway. Is that it? Is that what you've decided?
I think the President decided for insertion.
No, the decision is made to insert, but it's going to take time to do that.
All right. So you've decided for insertion, but it doesn't take place. But I want to know whether that's a feasible option.
There seems to be some misunderstanding about my request. Packaging of this thing. I'm not talking about cosmetics. I'm talking about substance. Unless someone has an argument why, about why the 3,500 can't be sent in on the first day, I would have no objection to it.
We have no problem.
Is there any problem?
There's no problem. There's no problem with a delay, Mr. President, of some hours until we can present the overall package to you.
And the hat that we're wearing that justifies this intervention, that we tell the Congress and the American people, is what? That we were invited in by the host government, that we took the action and asked for approval later, or what? Mr. President, we are operating on what principle?
Do you have a suggestion?
No, sir. I suggest that those who now have moving immediately into military intervention, a position I support as a necessity over time, had better be better prepared to tell you what you're doing it, under what guise you're doing it, under what terms you're doing it, than simply just to do it. If we are going in response and in aid of Colonel Shirazi, we are doing precisely what the Russians are doing. We are also setting a precedent from now forth that any group which establishes a regime in name, if not in fact, outside the central government of any nation has the right and can be expected to receive the support of one of the great powers in the dismemberment of that nation. We cannot go in there on the request of the colonel and expect to have any precedent except accession to such action in the future by the Soviet Union or anyone else. I think, Mr. President, for us to go in under this guise is simply to say Iran today, 20 Irans tomorrow, and everything except fact.
Why can't we simply say that we are acting out of a spirit of collective security and in protection of the U.S. national interests as announced by President Carter? President Carter said a threat to the Gulf, if I recall, was a threat to U.S. national security. So it's not something we've just dreamed up. It's not the first time we've had to confront a threat to the Gulf.
It is the first time we will have in fact acted militarily in direct conflict to make good on that particular principle. And in doing so, I think it is necessary that we not set precedents we do not wish to live with in other cases in the future.
On what grounds did we send troops to Dominican Republic under President Johnson?
Safety of American citizens.
Yes.
Well, there must be some American citizens in Iran.
70 or 110, did you say? 110 that we put there.
6,000 are pretty soon.
We're sending them. But I think it's time to summarize the key decisions that we've made. We've had extensive discussion of both the rationale and the detail of those decisions. And they are as follows. First, we will begin the introduction of U.S. forces into southern Iran and the necessary movements to support further deployments and logistical support in the area. Secondly, the Secretary of State will convey to the Soviet ambassador our grave concern about their move into Iran and insist on the immediate removal of their forces. Third, appropriate messages will be sent to friendly heads of state to obtain their support and, where necessary, specific cooperation. Fourth, I will undertake immediately following this meeting the necessary briefing of congressional leaders and the press. I will undertake to meet tomorrow with former senior government officials. Fifth, we will call for a meeting of the UN Security Council. And sixth, we will seek direct contact with authorities in Tehran. If there are no questions, that will conclude our discussion of these issues. Thank you all very much.
The crisis that is at the heart of this war game is halfway around the world, but its implications for the United States are devastating. Several divisions of Soviet troops have moved into northern Iran. For U.S. interests, this is infinitely more threatening than the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. If Russian troops keep moving south and are unopposed, they will control not only the oil fields, but the Persian Gulf itself. Western Europe and Japan, which are almost totally dependent on oil from that region, would be at the Soviet Union's mercy. Recognizing that this would give Moscow the leverage to split NATO and the United States, the President and his National Security Council meet in emergency session.
Good morning, Mr. President.
Good morning.
I'll update you on the situation in Southwest Asia. In Iran, we now have identified 6 Soviet divisions which have crossed the border. Previously, we had briefed you that the Airborne Division was located at both Kermanshah and Hamadan. What has happened in the meanwhile is the Airborne Division appears to be consolidating on Kermanshah, and the Air Assault Division, which we briefed you on earlier, appears to be consolidating on Hamadan. The 3rd Regiment of the Airborne Division still remains in the vicinity of Tabriz. Air defense elements have been moved forward in some number, so that we have now a fairly extensive air defense capability here, and at the various airfields throughout the area of the 6 invading divisions. The 4 mechanized rifle divisions continue to move southward toward these airheads on the parallel routes as shown here. The interdiction affected by the pro-Western forces and the dissident elements up here has resulted in some slowing down of that movement. So instead of being able to close in a 2-week period as we initially estimated, we now estimate that it will take an additional week from today before those motorized rifle divisions are able to close on Kermanshah and Hamadan. On 13 May, as you're aware, a U.S. reconnaissance aircraft, an RF-4E, was lost over the northwestern corner of Iran, and we do not know the cause of that loss. Both the United States and the Soviet Union have advisors with the forces here and here. Both have sustained casualties. We have lost KIA 7 individuals that have been assisting the pro-U.S. forces, generally in the more exposed areas here. The Soviets, we understand, have lost at least 15 advisors. The pro-Western Iranian Air Force here, that is Colonel Shirazi's air elements, have been heavily attrited because they have attempted to conduct some efforts in this area here, and they lost some aircraft in those efforts, but additionally, they lost a sizable number of aircraft on their airfields because an attack of airplanes with what appeared to be URA, that is the Iranian dissident forces here, markings, attacked airfields in this area here. We understand that those aircraft were actually flown by Soviet pilots.
Whoever the pilots were, they were Soviet planes that struck with URA markings, yes. Soviet planes.
Thank you. Mr. Blake?
Thank you, Mr. President. I can very quickly summarize the responses to our diplomatic initiatives around the world. Now, with regard to our responses beginning on the periphery, the Koreans have agreed to supply a battalion-sized unit to join our forces in Iran. They've pointed out, however, that they lack transportation to do that, and we'll have to provide some airlift and sea lift for their equipment. So we can do that very quickly.
What was that?
The ANZUS nations have expressed great sympathy and concern over the situation, and the governments themselves have said they would like to help, but feel that they must refer these requests to their parliaments. And this is now being considered in the appropriate committees in the two nations' parliaments. The Japanese have expressed considerable support for our actions and understanding of the reasons for it, and specifically have expressed support for the movement of the Nimitz away from their own waters into the Indian Ocean. The Chinese deputy foreign minister received our ambassador and received his message, but did not make any comment at that time. Now, closer in the region itself...
What is the Chinese public position then?
The Chinese public position has condemned the Soviet intervention in Iran in very strong terms. Now, as for immediate base rights and overflight rights, we have received favorable responses and are making use of either bases or overflight rights in Egypt, Oman, Jordan, Sudan, Morocco, Somalia, Kenya, and Israel. All those countries have expressed support for our actions and have pledged to do all they can to help out in the situation. Our gravest disappointment has been with the Saudi government, which has not as yet responded officially to our request, nor given any clear indication of what their response might be to base U.S. military forces in Saudi Arabia itself. And it's clear that we require additional high-level contacts to try to clarify this situation. The Arab Emirates and Kuwait have also deferred a response, and they're obviously waiting for the Saudis to make up their minds first.
How about Israel?
Israel has offered whatever facilities we might need or could use.
And Turkey again, Barry?
Turkey's position is that they'll permit logistical buildup at the bases there, but they do not feel that NATO has gone far enough to make them feel comfortable with actual operations or additional deployments to those bases.
Thank you very much.
Any word out of the United Nations?
There was a resolution, a long discussion resolution in the United Nations, which the Soviets vetoed in the Security Council.
Any abstinence? Any abstaining votes in the Security Council?
Yes, Angola was a member of the Council and abstained on the measure.
Any response from the Soviets?
I'm not aware of any as yet.
In that regard, Mr. President, we have a very important next visitor, and I think it's time to call him in. Arnold Horlick is a former ambassador to the Soviet Union, as you know, and has a distinguished career record in that field. And he apparently is carrying a message from the Soviet leadership. And this is obviously extremely significant because we've heard nothing from the Soviets since this began. So this will be the first authoritative message from the Soviet Union since we entered this crisis a couple of weeks ago. Ambassador, welcome.
Mr. President,
I think you know the ambassador.
Yes, Mr. Ambassador.
I've just returned from a lunch with the Soviet ambassador. He called me on very short notice. He was in an extremely agitated state, which is unusual for him. And even more unusual, he barely touched his lunch. And he had, I think, a message that he wanted very badly, although using an unofficial channel, to communicate to you and to your colleagues in the government. He had 4 points. First, he said that the Soviet leadership is very deeply alarmed by your decision to intervene militarily in Iran. He said that they regarded this as a reckless and an unwarranted move, that their objective in Iran was limited, that they had employed limited forces to achieve a limited objective, and that the United States, by intervening militarily in Iran itself, was in the process of transforming what had been a troublesome regional issue into a major international crisis that was endangering world peace. He said several times that in the view of the Soviet leadership, the deployment of U.S. forces directly into Iran threatens the most vital Soviet security interests. Second, he repeated several times also that the presence of U.S. military forces in Iran on the southern border of the Soviet Union is unacceptable to Soviet leaders, and he said that they were resolute and determined that those American forces should be withdrawn. Thirdly, he made a very pointed allusion to the Cuban Missile Crisis. He reminded me that this was not 1962 and that that Iran is not Cuba. Iran is not 90 miles from the United States. It's clear to me, Mr. President, that his intention was to convey to us a message that says, in the light of the altered strategic balance, both the nuclear balance and the conventional regional balances in the world in the past 20, 25 years, that the Soviet leadership no longer considers that it is for them to make concessions in a crisis, particularly one that occurs in their own backyard. I think also he wanted to impress on us, because he mentioned East Germany several times, that the Soviet leadership is now working under extraordinary pressure. He didn't make explicit what he meant by that, but I think what he was trying to convey to us was the impression that this was a particularly dangerous time to be pushing a Soviet leadership that was beset by crises both in East and the West. Now, at one point near the end of our lunch, he said very slowly and very deliberately, and I think I have his remarks verbatim, U.S. leaders should not be under the illusion that there can be any outcome of this crisis that will leave U.S. military forces in Iran where they pose a direct security threat to the Soviet Union. He said that there had been no Western military forces in Iran for 40 years and that none will be permitted now. Finally, at the end of our conversation, he said that he thought it was still not too late to prevent a direct U.S.-Soviet military clash. He would not say what moves the Soviet Union intended if the U.S. deployments did not cease and if U.S. forces were not withdrawn, but he did point out, again, very pointedly, that there were many Soviet military assets in the southern military districts of the Soviet Union that had not been brought to bear, and reminded me once again that Iran was close to the heartland of the Soviet Union and far from the United States. He seemed to imply, but was very vague about it, that the Soviet Union does not rule out a political agreement to cover the withdrawal of U.S. forces, but he refused to be drawn out on the question of what the Soviet Union might be prepared to do in return. And that concluded our lunch.
Did anything he say suggest that he was suggesting a deal of mutual withdrawal?
I think he was opening up that possibility, as well as leaving open the possibility that if U.S. forces were not otherwise withdrawn, that the Soviets might indeed attack them. I think he was presenting a message which suggested that there were at least two possibilities.
Mr. Ambassador, I don't gather from anything you've said that you got any impression that the Soviets might be considering some plan for a mutual withdrawal.
No, I did try to press him on that, and as I indicated, he simply would not be drawn out on what the Soviets might agree to do in return.
But he didn't rule that out, I take it, when you pushed him on it.
That's correct.
He indicated nothing.
That's correct.
Well, Arnold, to return to the central debate for the last 2 weeks about Soviet intentions, on the basis of this and other indications, do you conclude that the Soviet objective is ultimately the oil fields and the Arabian Sea, or are they, in fact, limiting their objectives to the northern part of Iran?
I think that still remains unclear, but it is very possible that whatever the Soviet original intentions were and whatever the timetable was, the intervention of U.S. forces, which I think from their point of view came earlier than they would have expected, if they expected it at all. They surely would have hoped to avert it. And I think they would have decided whether to limit their objectives to the northern part of Iran or to move further south, depending on the U.S. reaction. I think they were surprised that the United States moved in as quickly as it did. And they are probably now in the process of recalculating their objectives, whatever they may be. Certainly, the intent of the ambassador was to have us believe that we cannot be confident that Soviet forces will not engage U.S. forces if that is the only way to drive us out.
Mr. President, I'm a little reluctant to draw sweeping conclusions, but you could argue that the Russians came fairly close to blinking in this conversation. I think that's an invitation to bargain, as you said, and I would think that we should give very serious thought to the kind of reply we make through this channel, but we also ought to consider whether we want to continue in this channel, which is really is not under a strict American government discipline, as opposed to the Secretary of State. But I think a lot of evidence is beginning to accumulate now, 2 weeks later, that whatever they thought they were going to do in Iran initially, that they were surprised at your quick response, and that they were then unsettled by what happened in Eastern Europe, which they probably did not anticipate, and they now find themselves faced with a double crisis. And I think they're looking for a way out.
I'm unable to see, Bill, how you can possibly place that interpretation on what I consider to be a harsh and contentious message.
Do you want the ambassador to stay around?
I think we ought to conclude our session with the ambassador. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you.
And we'll be in touch. I am afraid I will have to excuse myself at this point and turn the chair over to the Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like very much to find a basis of settlement with the Soviet Union before we have a direct confrontation. When that confrontation takes place, if it should, then you have a tendency to get embedded into that course of action. Whether you win it or lose it, you're in a battle, and each side gets concerned over their world posture, and each side becomes determined to win it. I would hope we might avoid that. And it would be a great diplomatic achievement if we could avoid a confrontation.
Mr. Secretary, I'd like to give you some information that I've just received, which indicates we already have a direct confrontation. That is that one of our Air Force airborne warning and control aircraft has been downed in the vicinity of eastern Turkey with a loss of 19 U.S. military personnel. There are several reports of incursions of Soviet aircraft across the Turkish border into Turkish airspace immediately prior to the downing. The AWACS indicated they were under attack from the air just prior to loss of contact, and the wreckage has been spotted and is definitely within Turkish territory. This represents the first attack, as you pointed out. We've not had a direct confrontation before. This represents the first attack against U.S. forces in the situation in which we're currently operating. So I think we have, in some instances crossed over that hurdle.
We cleared it. It's the Soviets that shot it down. I don't think that is clear, is it?
It's not clear. It's not absolutely certain, except that there were Soviet aircraft across the Turkish border immediately prior to the downing. We know that from the air defense reports from eastern Turkey.
But I don't think we can necessarily conclude yet that it was a Soviet action that shot that plane down.
Well, I don't know who else is up there.
We can conclude it. We can't prove it.
But that doesn't, Mr. Secretary, that doesn't invalidate the point you're making. Something like this does not mean that the entire crisis has to turn on one event. Remember, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, we had a U-2 shot down, and had the United States made its entire policy based on that single incident, we probably would have made a terrible mistake. Not that this isn't important, but I think you are raising something that we have to pursue. The Russians have at least offered an opening. They will almost certainly put pressure on us. They will almost certainly try and make a bargain in which we get out of Iran and they stay under the guise of not going further or something like that, and we lay off in Eastern Europe. But it seems to me that we have a fairly simple move at this point, which is to call him in, for you to call him in and say, we have reason to believe you want to open up a dialogue at this point in this crisis and see what happens.
I would be in accord with your view. It will take time for these negotiations to proceed. They may be valueless, but I think we must test them out. May I turn to another subject? We must meet it because it could be with us sooner than we might think. The question I addressed to you, ladies and gentlemen, how far are we willing to go to stop a Soviet thrust into the oil fields of South Iran? Do we go the whole way? Do we say whatever it takes we will do? I think, Jim, perhaps we'd start you on that.
If we were to withdraw our forces, the consequences would be catastrophic.
Yeah, okay.
The entire politics of the Persian Gulf would be instantly transformed, as well as our alliance system in Western Europe. The Japanese would have to change sides. We face, if we give up the oil fields, certain political catastrophe for the United States. On the other side, we may have a higher assessment that the Soviets may move than 10% that we used some weeks ago, but it is not that much higher, and the problem of escalation is on the backs of the Soviets. I remind you that they are now having trouble in Eastern Europe, that they are not anxious with their troubles in Eastern Europe to augment their conflict in the Middle East. And as a consequence, it is not the time for the United States to retreat, not in an area that we all agree is our vital interest.
Mr. Secretary. I think we keep straying from the point.
Mr. Secretary.
Excuse me. May I put it in another way? Let's get right to it, and I want to hear from General Meyer. Assume, if you will, for purpose of discussion. You don't have to agree that it's going to happen. Please assume that the Soviets decide that they're going to do whatever is necessary to go all the way to the Persian Gulf. Now, General, give us your answer. What should the policy of the United States be in the event that takes place?
The President of the United States told me, when he told us to draw up a plan for committing forces there, that this area was so vital, that it had such an impact upon the survival of the United States that he wanted to commit forces there. That's the basis upon which we put the forces in there. Therefore, I believe that we have to go all the way in carrying out that basic mission if it is in fact vital.
Mr. Secretary. All right.
I have to say that I am in disagreement, and I think that perhaps the most useful exercise in response to your question is to generate the array of concrete options of what in fact we will do and what in fact we are unwilling to do, and there are a whole range of options.
But in the event, again, it's hypothetical.
Yes.
In the event that they choose to go to the Persian Gulf, would you at any time be willing for us to withdraw voluntarily?
I think it'll come to destruction before withdrawal. But the answer is yes, I am not willing to go all the way, and I think we've got to face that too. I don't think the American people would support that.
Hardy?
I think, Mr. Secretary, if there were an all-out Soviet assault on our forces calling into question their survival, it would be a declaration which would be so explicit on their part that we indeed have to answer, yes, we will go all the way. It would, to me, be, and this was the first time I would say this in my adult lifetime, it would be the first time that they were striking directly, centrally at our vitals and saying, this is the end. This is not some far-off Asian battle involving a split of land which may or may not be central to us. This is a place we have said is central, and it is not even disputed by Congress, our allies, and now by the President of the United States.
Mr. Secretary, I've gotten some new intelligence that I think changes things rather radically, and I'd like to give it to the group more or less the way I got it on the telephone. You know, we've had people with Shirazi's forces, the pro-American forces, including some CIA people, and they now send in a rather urgent message saying that those forces are beginning to disintegrate into disarray and in retreat. Apparently a crisis of confidence is what they're talking about, but unfortunately one of the problems is that some of our American advisors are missing. What happened to them, I'm not clear, and we're going to try and find out. My contact through the agency with Shirazi has passed a message over our channels to the effect that he is asking us for immediate, massive assistance, by which he means U.S. troops. And he's talking about putting them north of an airfield at Dezful, which would bring them fairly close to Soviet forces. Secondly, possibly related, but at least important intelligence, for the first time in this crisis, some Soviet ballistic missile submarines have moved out of port, not on a schedule that we would have anticipated, something different and unusual. Third, a high-level Polish civilian official defected in Germany today and brought with him a report that he claims the Soviets are acting according to a predetermined plan to take over all of Iran. The preliminary report is that he is quite reliable given his position, but it's hard for me to judge. Finally, I just got an additional message through CIA channels from the Saudi royal family saying they wanted the U.S. to understand that they considered our actions thus far in the crisis as quite, quote, weak, unquote, and that explains their refusal to commit themselves. So I put that out to you at this time because I think all of it bears on our discussion, and I don't have anything further to clarify.
I think we should go back to the Saudis and say that if they're interested in us being strong, the starting point is to let us use their terrain for a more rapid buildup.
It is my belief that we will be able to persuade the Saudis. And the reason for that is Soviet domination of the Persian Gulf would hurt the Saudis more than any other country there. They would control them, the Saudis would be through. Let me bring up another issue. And we haven't talked about it now. We've forgotten entirely about the Congress. We're talking about the executive decisions to send troops into Iran. I believe that we better give attention to the Congress meeting, and as the conflict grows, as it is in Iran, it seems to me we may be ready, or soon we'll be ready, for a declaration of war by the Congress. That means that's worldwide on our part. Wherever the Soviets have an interest any place in the world, it becomes open season if we have a declaration of war. Every Soviet vessel on the high seas is a target. And it seems to me that that would be almost the most unattractive result that the Soviets could find in their effort to develop some posture in the world, economic progress, getting grain from other countries that they need and so forth. It seems to me that a move of that kind might acquaint them with the bitter price they'd pay in becoming more bitter all the time as the forces of the United States plus other free nations would move in to restrict their activity in the world.
Clark,
I would be glad if anyone addressed himself
Clark,
to that.
I beg you to reconsider this. We are faced with the possibility that the Soviets might attack our forces. That possibility has generated our concern about our position. It is still undemonstrated. We do not wish to precipitate war. We want the responsibility for a clash to rest on the Soviets and let them make the calculations leading to escalation. The Soviet Union continues to be a nuclear-armed power. A declaration of war will provide legitimacy for the Soviets to initiate the use of those nuclear weapons.
Excuse me. Mr. President, so you might get in on it, the last subject was whether or not we might consider, as an alternative course of action, at some time in the future, a declaration of war by the United States against the Soviet Union, with all that entails, with our naval forces around the world, with Soviet assets in different places, their vulnerability. It comes under the heading of our search for means by which we can add to the pressure on the Soviet Union. We've been considering every alternative.
Let me review my comments on this, Mr. President. I regard that possibility certainly as unattractive to the Soviet Union, but it should be highly unattractive to us. What we have been saying to this point is that the Soviet Union has threatened the possibility of a direct clash with a limited deployment of U.S. forces, one which we think that they are prepared to negotiate on. Moreover, minutes ago, it was the general view in this room that we should refrain from stirring trouble in Eastern Europe in order to avoid provoking the Soviet Union, and at the same time that we talk of avoiding provocations to the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, we are beginning to discuss all-out war. If we are prepared to declare war, why are we unwilling to have a stirring of trouble for the Soviets in Eastern Europe? There is no logic to this.
Excuse me, Mr. President, they're going to send in dinner now so we can continue working as we have our meal.
Wouldn't it be a healthier diet to begin eating some of our words?
Mr. President, it might be helpful for you and the group if I summarize where I think we are at this point. I think there is a general consensus that we wish to, whatever it takes, to hold the southern part of Iran, namely the oil fields in the Persian Gulf. Within that context, so far there seems to be a consensus developing for your approval to do the following: to pursue negotiations with the Soviet Union, taking their approach through Ambassador Horlick as being a serious possibility we should consider, no matter how harsh the language. Secondly, to check out much further detail the reports of the erosion of Shirazi forces. Thirdly, now some of these occurred in your absence, but I briefed you a little bit on this outside. There does not seem to be any disposition here to stir up trouble in Eastern Europe. There's a strong view, particularly put forcefully by the Secretary of State in your absence, that we've got to get the allies in Europe in particular, and Japan and elsewhere, to do more to be with us in this crisis, even to the extent of getting deployment of European troops, even if symbolic at first, to that area. It is their interest as much of ours, if not more so. It is important for U.S. domestic and congressional opinion to be seen that this is a multilateral effort. I think there's also a general disposition to continue the U.S. deployments that you set in motion a couple of weeks ago. And finally, there seems to be some disposition to continue to bolster Shirazi forces, although we do need more information on his situation. It seems to me these are the general strands of a strategy that are emerging. And at some point, we're going to want to focus on what specifically do we say to the Soviet Union as we go back to them.
Mr. President, I'd like to dissent somewhat from Winston's presentation. You were not here. We did have a discussion of possible escalation in other areas. We didn't pursue it for too long.
I said it was inconclusive.
But one of the areas that was raised, and I think deserves to be considered, is to be in a position to put some pressure on Cuba. I argued and would argue again that it is an asset of the Soviet Union that is very highly prized, and if once it is put in danger, at risk, or seems to be, they have to begin to recalculate and reconsider whether their actions are not bringing them a substantial defeat in the Caribbean. I think it is the one tool that we have got to use at some point in this crisis, because as long as this crisis remains confined to Iran and Southeast Asia, we are at a substantial disadvantage. We do not have the forces to match escalation by the Soviet Union. I think we have to be ready to go beyond the bounds of the local crisis and introduce another factor. It is too dangerous, in my view, to introduce the Eastern European factor, although we could cause a nightmare for the Soviet Union in Eastern Germany, but I think we would be on the border of a nuclear war. But there are other areas, Cuba, we also debated South Yemen as a possibility, which I think are not being given the kind of serious consideration in U.S. policy that I would strongly recommend to you.
What would you do with reference to Cuba?
I would begin to make it clear to the Russians that we will put some direct pressure on Cuba. I would reinforce it in Guantanamo. I would, whatever naval forces we still have, I would begin to move in the direction of Cuba. And in your conversations, Mr. Secretary, since they introduced Cuba, they were the ones that said it's not 1962. The situation has changed since Cuba. Let us pick up that theme and say everything hasn't changed.
I've listened to some of your discussion when I was out of the room, and I've heard it here. And I think you've come to grips with the issues that are before us. But on this point, I feel quite strongly. So that I guess I would say at this point that I'm not prepared to engage in horizontal escalation at this until we have defined our response to the Haldeck message. I'm prepared to listen to further arguments against that course if anyone wishes to make it.
Yes, sir. I think that we can examine, study what those possibilities might be. But in addition to that issue, we have an issue of specific response. Mr. President, as you know, an AWACS aircraft was shot down unquestionably by Soviet fighters that had illegally crossed the border and were inside of Turkey when they shot that down. That is a major loss to us. The Soviets have no equivalent aircraft. Nonetheless, I do not think that we can accept the loss of one aircraft in this manner without responding. I would suggest that we recognize that the Soviets have bare aircraft on reconnaissance that are going over our fleet in the Indian Ocean. And I think that one of those aircraft, rapidly dispatched by a Phoenix missile, should suddenly disappear.
Are you suggesting this without any protest, without any communication?
A response of this sort is a form of communication.
Mr. President, I do not believe we went in here with the idea that we were going to play tit for tat on every single loss of life and material facility. We are at this very moment in receipt of some kind of communication from the Russians, which we are in the process of exploring. If this is a good idea today, that is the dispatch quickly of some Soviet plane with a message that goes with it, it'll be a good idea a couple of days from now. In the meantime, by doing it now, I think we tend to raise real questions as to the seriousness of our desire for negotiation.
Am I to understand that the Soviets can dispatch an AWACS aircraft with impunity after crossing an international frontier in an area in which the AWACS has continually flown?
No, it is not with impunity. It is, however, on our part, simply with some regard for what we believe our overall objective should be, that we can, as a great power, hold for a moment while we try to accomplish our larger objective, always knowing that we have the ability to do what you want, which is to swat a fly. What I thought we were trying to do was to save something more considerable than that.
I think we'll hear from the general.
First, yeah, let me.
Can I speak before the general? We've got to put something up on the table in Iran. If U.S. forces are going to move forward close enough to be in possible contact with the Russians, then I think we should do everything feasible to strengthen their position on the ground. I'm not talking about nuclear weapons. I'm talking about ammunition, helicopters, whatever the hell it takes to make the Russians realize that this is the moment of truth with the United States in Iran. And I don't think we're going to do it unless you, sir, make a determination that we are going ahead on this track and we're not going to be diverted by the abstract question of nuclear weapons or the nitty-gritty question of do we put in a few more forces for Shirazi and so forth. Because I think our policy, 16 days later, is beginning to pay off.
General?
Yes, no, and I support that completely. I believe that it's absolutely essential that we continue with the program as I outlined just a few moments ago, that we move these specially designed forces, the forces that are designed uniquely for this terrain, this area of the world, with the kinds of technology that we have that those forces do not have, with the advantages of the terrain, to move up into the areas that we're talking about, to send the message that we're talking about. We can do that and continue on the route we're headed. I do not believe that we should ignore the Shirazi forces because I think that's an economy of force type thing, and we ought to take any advantage we can of that. And I also believe that we ought to make whatever overtures we can to take advantage of those forces in the Islamic Republic which we can to create that additional front. So I think we ought to be looking in all of those directions at this time to create the kinds of pressures and signal.
Mr. President, Jim. I think that this is an issue on which you can reach a decision very quickly. The cost to the United States of further attempts to buttress the Shirazi forces are very low. If we do not put in that minimal investment, those forces will be dissipated.
What do we need by way of reinforcements, General? I assume
You've
planes,
given us the instructions, and we'll continue to increase the flow of Army forces, Marine forces, and the Air Force forces into the region. And I'll have that package laid out for you in the message we send you in the morning that sort of gives you your early morning status report. I'll see that Wynn gets it.
Mr. President, it's 2 a.m. now, and I think given the fact you've asked this group to reconvene early in the morning, that we probably should adjourn. I think the basic lines that you wish to follow have been laid out, at least for the next few hours.
If we can't lay out the line for a few hours, we're in serious business.
Is the Secretary of State doing the negotiating, Mr. President?
Yes.
He will, not Ambassador Horley.
Well, the return message will be through Horlick. I guess we're assuming here that the Secretary of State will find himself engaged in conversations with the Soviet ambassador.
If there is a positive answer to Horlick's message.
That's what I wasn't sure we were absolutely certain on.
I thought that after the conversation between the Soviet ambassador and Mr. Horlick would go back. He's expected to go back. He would go back and say, our interesting discussion, which you would know I was under obligation to, I reported to the Secretary of State. He thinks it might be of value if you and he were to sit down and have a talk. And I think that's what Anatoly Dobrynin's had in mind all along. But he didn't want to come and be repulsed.
Precisely. Are there other issues to decide tonight? Thank you all very much, and we'll see you
At dawn?
At dawn.
Thank you, Mr. President.